Good afternoon, students, and welcome back. If you were joining me yesterday, this week we are talking about the American Revolution in eighth grade social studies. Today we're going to be covering the Declaration of Independence. As the American Revolution gets started, it becomes obvious that the colonists are going to have to declare independence against Great Britain. And so this is the document that we're going to be talking about today. Declaration of Independence, what is it all about? It's basically in the title, guys. The 13 colonies will declare independent. In other words, they don't want to be part of Great Britain or England anymore. Moving on to the next slide. It's not moving. There it is. Couple of vocabulary words that you do need to know for the Declaration of Independence. These are obviously words that they would use. We don't see them so much today, but they were very popular back then. The first word is endowed. The word endowed is given. Self evident is obvious. Unalienable is a word that you should already know in this class. They were rights that could not be taken away. This is the idea that we got from John Locke. He was an English philosopher, and he basically had the idea that everyone should be born with unalienable rights. Certain rights, such as the right to have life, the right to have liberty, to be free, and the right to own property. So back then in England, not everybody was born with these rights. And so John Locke came up with this concept. It's important today because as we're talking about the Declaration of Independence, the author of the Declaration of Independence is going to look back at John Locke's ideas and said, that's probably a good idea. We should probably include it in the Declaration of Independence. Consent means to agree, you are in agreement with something. Abolish, to get rid of or to do away with. And then the last word is grievances. Grievances were basically complaints. And the colonists will list, I want to say 27 different complaints as to why, reasons as to why they want to break up with Great Britain or England or King George III, who was the King of England at the time. Now, what happens when you have problems with a friend? What have you tried to sort out? How do you sort out your differences? And I want to say almost all of us have come to a point where we've had conflict with someone. Usually you try to come to a resolution with that friend. When a resolution cannot be made, this is where we see a fallout or a breakup. And that's what's going to happen between the 13 colonies and England. Now, we're going to hold a meeting, and this meeting will be taking place in where a lot of important meetings will take place. We know that this picture right here is Independence Hall. It is located in Pennsylvania. And so the Second Continental Congress, this second meeting that will happen in July of 1776, all of these leaders from the American colonies meet here and declare that they want independence against Great Britain. Prior to this, we have seen where they did try to come to a resolution with the King of England. Remember, they sent over that olive branch petition, which was like a final say to England or to King George, basically telling him, look, we don't want to have these problems. Let's try to work something out. It was kind of like a last peace mediation from the colonies to King George. King George reads it and basically says, I don't negotiate with traitors. And so we're going to have a war. And this is where the colonists say, well, okay, if we're going to break up with King George and England, we do need to make it official. It's kind of like you're going to break up with someone, you've been dating someone, you're going to break up with them. You kind of don't just cut it off like that. Usually, you give a reason why you're breaking up. And so the colonists will come together in the Second Continental Congress to try and draft what is the Declaration of Independence, that why, that letter that says why they're breaking up with King George. Some of the writers of the Declaration of Independence are going to be, the main author is going to be Thomas Jefferson. He was the main guy. Thomas Jefferson will go on to be the third president of the United States. John Adams will help him out as well. He will become the second president of the United States. Some other characters would be Roger Sherman and Philip Livingston. And Benjamin Franklin makes another appearance. We've seen Benjamin Franklin during the French and Indian War. Remember, he came out with the Albany Plan of Union. He was the one that told the colonists, we are either going to join or die at the hands of the French. And so that Albany Plan of Union was used to unite the colonists. Benjamin Franklin, for the Declaration of Independence, will make the final revisions. And here we have some dialogue going on between our founding fathers. We have Benjamin Franklin saying another fragment, look at all them commas. And then maybe John Adams was saying, this is bad. And then Thomas Jefferson is saying, Ben, stop. Don't be so negative. So these were the three main gentlemen that were working on this Declaration of Independence, this breakup letter that's going to get sent over to King George. Now, in total, once the Declaration of Independence is completed, there's going to be 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence. Only 8 of these men were born in Britain. The main guy that signs the Declaration of Independence, or the most famous person that signs the Declaration of Independence, his name is John Hancock. I don't know if you've ever heard the term when you have to sign something. It's mostly popular in adults. They said, give me your John Hancock. It's like a famous signature. So remember, guys, 56 men signed the Declaration of Independence. At this time, women really don't play a role in any of these important events. Let's go ahead and listen to what the Declaration of Independence possibly sounded like, coming from a person maybe like George Washington. So here's a little good video that shows you the reading of the Declaration of Independence.
Joan. Here, you earned this. Sure you wrote it big enough?
Yes, but old King George should be able to see that. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, a decent respect requires that they declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident: that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to establish new government. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, do, and with the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved of all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. In the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
So George Washington was reading there the Declaration of Independence. Very, very strong words. So, where do we get some of the ideas that were just mentioned in the speech for the Declaration of Independence? And it's important to know, guys, that signing the Declaration of Independence, as we see those 56 men signing it, they were very wary of what they were signing. To sign the Declaration of Independence was basically an act of treason. You were going against the British Crown. So those 56 men, if they were caught signing the Declaration of Independence, they could be charged with treason, which could end up eventually ending up in their deaths. So ideas of the Declaration of Independence. Where does Thomas Jefferson get some of these ideas? He was inspired by a familiar face that we've already talked about, John Locke. Remember, John Locke was an English philosopher. He came up with the idea that everyone should be born with certain unalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the right to own property. Well, Thomas Jefferson looks at this and says, hey, those are good ideas. We should possibly include those in the Declaration of Independence, because they were basically telling the king that everybody should be born with these natural rights. Everybody should have the opportunity to have life, liberty. But Thomas Jefferson will change the last part. If he wouldn't have changed it, this probably would have been plagiarism. And John Locke would have basically said, hey, you're copying me. But Thomas Jefferson changes the end. And he changes it from life, liberty, and the right to own property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's how Thomas Jefferson includes it in the Declaration of Independence. They're basically telling the king, look, yeah, you're a king, and just because you were born a king doesn't mean that you have ownership over us. We should all be entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And these are rights that we are born with, rights that are granted by God, granted by your creator, rights that cannot be taken away unless you have a good reason, unless you break the law of some sort. So this is where Thomas Jefferson got some of his ideas. Another idea that was included in the Declaration of Independence is a very, very important line, that to secure these rights, government are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. In other words, the people that should have the rights, the people who should have all the power within the government, are the people themselves, the people that are being governed. And today we have that type of government, which is a democracy. How do we know that people have the power in the United States? Because they have the opportunity to vote for their representatives. And in this picture, we see it. There is a representative. Let's say that guy is the president of the United States. He represents the United States. But the only way that he gets to represent us is because we vote for him. So essentially, we have the power through voting. And that's the way it should be. We included this in the Declaration of Independence, saying that the only people, or the only way that a government can have its power, is if the people vote on him having their power. We shouldn't be run by a monarchy, by a king or queen, just because a king or queen says so. A government should be run by the people. The purpose of a government is to protect people's rights. And the power of the government comes from the people. Now, the Declaration of Independence is a rather lengthy document. And anytime you're going to write an essay, do you just write everything in one long paragraph? No. We kind of divide it up into sections. We usually have 3 sections in an essay. We got our introduction, we got our body, and then we got our conclusion. Well, the Declaration of Independence has 3 sections as well. The introduction to the Declaration of Independence is called the preamble. And basically in the introduction, you kind of introduce what you're going to be talking about. So the introduction of the Declaration of Independence basically starts stating what they're going to talk about in their body. The middle section, or the body of the Declaration of Independence, basically listed all of the complaints, all of the reasons that we were breaking up with King George and with England. And then, of course, the last part of the Declaration of Independence is the conclusion, also known as the resolution, where they put in their final thoughts. Again, the preamble starts out with, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve their political bands. They're basically telling the king, look, throughout history, people are going to have to break up. And it's necessary to break up with one country because of the following reasons. And in the Declaration of Independence preamble, in the introduction as well, this is where Thomas Jefferson included those unalienable rights. And he uses it by saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident. These are truths that are obvious. All men are created equal, that we are endowed, we are given these rights by our Creator. We are born with these rights. Which rights are they? Unalienable rights. Some of these rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What is meant by all men are created equal? I like to bring up this topic in the class because when Thomas Jefferson was saying all men are created equal, what was he really saying? Because if you think about it, all men weren't created equal, or all men didn't have equality in the colonies or throughout England, because we had the existence of slavery. So when Thomas Jefferson is saying all men are created equal, he was basically saying that nobody's born with power, such as a king, that everybody should be born as free people, or not everybody, everybody. Essentially, we're talking about white men, because those are the people that were considered to have all of this equality. So not everybody's equal at the time. Moving on to the grievances or the body of the Declaration of Independence. In total, there were 27 complaints, reasons why they wanted to gain their independence. And these are some of the most popular. First one, he has refused to pass or forbidden his governors to pass important and necessary laws. So basically, the king wouldn't let the colonies pass laws. Number two, he has broken up certain legislators. Legislators is where they make laws that opposed him and refused to let others be elected. Basically, he wasn't letting the colonies establish their own laws or letting colonists be elected to make laws. He has refused to establish courts of justice and made the judges dependent on him for their jobs and salaries. So if there were any judges within the colonies, the king basically put them there. He has sent swarms of British officers to harass our people and eat our food. We talked about this during the causes of the revolution, that the Quartering Act was passed by England, in which we had to quarter soldiers in our homes. So swarms of British officers were forced to live in our homes, eat our food. We had to provide for them. The next one, he has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of legislators. So they were sending troops and troops over and over just to be on top of what the colonists were doing. So they kind of felt like their privacy was being invaded. And that especially happens when we see that Boston Massacre. And then for cutting off trade with all parts of the world, going back to the Navigation Acts, remember the colonists were only allowed to trade with England. They weren't allowed to trade with any other countries to work off of that system of mercantilism. For imposing taxes on us without our consent. That's one of the biggest grievances. Remember that the colonists were forced to pay taxes, and they didn't have a say. There was nobody in England from the colonies voting on what taxes should be passed or how much the taxes should be. This was called taxation without representation. And then the last one, for depriving us in many cases the benefits of trial by jury. So a lot of times when the colonists were accused of a crime, they were not given trial by jury. So there's some of the complaints or the main grievances that were listed in the Declaration of Independence. And then in the conclusion, were basically the resolution, basically their final thoughts. Resolve that these united colonies are and right ought to be free and independent states. They're basically saying, look, we should be free because of all of the reasons that we mentioned to you, listed above. And that basically sums up the Declaration of Independence, guys. The Declaration of Independence, of course, again, was written to declare independence against Great Britain. The war has just begun. So tomorrow we'll dive into what the rest of the war looks like. The Declaration of Independence gets signed early on during the American Revolution. And so the war will still carry out, and we will see whether the colonists do gain their independence or not. You do have a Google Forms to work on. You do have a total of 5 questions that you need to answer based on the lesson that I have given you today on the Declaration of Independence. And for those of you who are still doing virtual learning, I will see you tomorrow to see what happens in the rest of the American Revolution.